share, often my journey started on this campus. Got sober as a client here, just like you.
I really do see phenomenal change.
Always hope. I've seen situations that on the surface look impossible become possible.
Doing this podcast is to share those recovery stories, be honest about what the challenges are and have some real conversations, but kind of share that out on the airwaves.
Welcome everybody to another episode of Airing Addiction. My name is Jesse Chason, one of the co-hosts. So excited that you thought to click on this, or if you're watching this live or later on in one of the many platforms. So excited that you'd be with us today for a very impactful conversation with somebody who certainly has a lot to offer. So I will turn it over to my co-host, Lisa. Good morning.
Morning, Jesse. I am really excited for this. Been looking forward to it for a while. I'm really grateful for our guest's time this morning. So I will introduce you. I'll do kind of the general introduction that we've kind of put out there, but then we'll just kind of turn it into a conversation. So with us today, we have Jarrett Krosoczka. He's the New York Times bestselling author, illustrator behind more than 40 books. He's widely popular Lunch Lady graphic novels, the Star Wars Jedi Academy, which happens to be my daughter's favorites. So just kind of put that out there. And what I really want to talk about a bit about today is the book, Hey Kiddo, which was a National Book Award finalist. Really, I think that you have a wonderful ability to take some really challenging topics and experience in your life and translate that to a graphic novel that has such a huge impact, to anyone that reads it. There's also some exciting things for me. I'm a Worcester native. And so even going through the book, it's around the corner, I live just around the corner from Webster Square off June Street. So I know that whole area, all the pictures I recognized, all the schools I recognized. So that was pretty impactful for me as well. So Jarrett, welcome to the Airing Addiction podcast.
Thank you, Lisa, and thank you, Jesse, for having me.
So I wonder if we could just start out, for anybody who hasn't heard of or read Hey Kiddo, can you give just a little bit of a description of what that novel is about and what you were hoping to accomplish with it?
Sure. So Hey Kiddo is a graphic memoir about my upbringing in Worcester, having been raised by my maternal grandparents after my birth mother, who was unable to raise me because of her addictions. And so for the general public knows, when a graphic novel, which is so people aren't always sure what exactly to call these pieces of literature. So a comic book is like a magazine versus a graphic novel is like a full book. But because my story is a memoir, it's actually called a graphic memoir. And so at any rate, I knew that telling my story through the visuals would be very, very impactful, because I could bring readers right there. Now, my first picture book was published way back in 2001. And back then, at 23 years old, I thought maybe I'd write about my life. And then I realized I wasn't quite ready yet to write the book, until I very publicly spoke about dealing with being a kid who was surrounded by addictions through a TED Talk in around 2012. And I met so many young people around the country who also dealt with addictions that surrounded them in their home lives. And there was this real epiphany that I had this knowledge of these intense emotions, but then I also had the way and platform in which to deliver the story through illustrated literature. So it's as equal parts funny, though, as it is challenging to deal with heavy emotions, because that's what life is. Life is a mix of the light and dark. But it took me a long time to get to the point where emotionally where I could write it. And I'm glad I waited, because I was able to write the book without pulling any punches and just sharing precisely what it was like to grow up surrounded by addiction.
Certainly, Jarrett, and I have the book right here. I was just telling Lisa, I finished it the other day, and I agree. Parts funny, parts sad, parts really catastrophic. it really was a roller coaster of emotions. And you mentioned, talking to high school kids all over the country and how many people could relate. Lisa and I have done some work locally here, preventative work in different high schools, and the amount of kids that come up to us after and I remember a few even very emotional in tears sharing their story. It's really profound. I'm just wondering, you said the TED Talk back in 2012, how that came to be and why you even agreed to speak out about something so personal and traumatic to yourself.
Well, it was something that was quite last minute. So the talk actually happened at it was at the very end of 2012, and I got a call at noon on a Friday, and it was the producer of the TEDx talks that were happening in the next town over. So to sort of explain the structure of TED Talk, so there's TED.com, that's the mothership, that's like the Major League Baseball of TED Talks, where they have these big conferences that happen internationally, and they publish a TED Talk of the day every day on their website. And there are TEDx talks where basically any organization can license the rights to do a TED event, but they have to hit a certain amount of parameters. They have to reach a certain amount of structure and getting together these speakers, and they need to have so many speakers. They can only have so many people in the audience, and they have to deliver the edited video to TEDx headquarters within a month. And every TEDx talk goes on YouTube. That doesn't mean it goes to TED.com, and that doesn't mean that even the TEDx YouTube page isn't the same as the TED YouTube page. So not every talk gets a wide audience. And so there was a TEDx Hampshire College, and the producer called me at noon to inform me that their headliner had quit last minute, had to cancel for health reasons. And would I be willing to jump in and give a talk last minute? And in that phone conversation, I thought she meant that the talk would be the next week, or even the next day, but it was actually that night. And I wasn't sure yet, and if I would be able to pull it together. And she said, well, I need to know, because we need to have that, fifth speaker, because otherwise we go against the licensing agreement that we signed, that we have to have so many speakers at each event. And so I committed, and then immediately began pacing the floor of my kitchen, wondering what I would talk about. And it was Gina, my wife, who pointed out that I was thinking to quote unquote TED Talky about it, and that I didn't have time to research something new. The only thing that I could deliver with certainty and conviction would be to tell my own life. And it was Gina who said, you should talk about everything that you've ever talked to me about. Talk about how you dealt with your mother's addiction to heroin, how you dealt with your grandparents who, while they loved you, they drank a lot, how art was a saving grace for you, how you had these wonderful teachers growing up who really helped you along the way. And so then I start spitballing, because mind you, the clock is ticking. Not only do I need to get over to where the TEDx talks are happening, I need to get myself presentable for stage, for cameras, for all of that. I have to get together my slide deck. And I said, okay, well, I'll get up, I was spitballing ideas. I said, I'll get up there and I'll say how I love to draw and my mother loved to draw, but my mother was addicted to drugs. And Gina stopped me and she said, no, like, you really should be unflinchingly honest and open with the audience. And you should say what the truth was, whether she was addicted to heroin. And so when my feet hit that stage at the TEDx event, no idea what was going to come of this, no idea what my performance would be. The only certainty I had that whatever I said and did would end up on the TEDx YouTube page. And I was able to give that 18-minute talk without stammering, without stuttering. And I do believe that when I said my mother, I love to draw and my mother loved to draw, but my mother was addicted to heroin. At that point, like, I grabbed the audience by the collar and said, you're going to listen to every single word I'm going to say over the next 18 minutes. And so that TEDx talk went viral, which caught the attention of TED.com, which thankfully the production at Hampshire College, the video production was top notch. that became a TED Talk of the day. And now it's been viewed 1.5 million plus views. And everywhere I went, and and it wasn't just high schools. I mean, it was elementary schools that I would visit, that a teacher would pull me aside to say, hey, we have some students here whose life very much mirrors your childhood. Or a kid themselves would come up to me and say, hey, I'm just like you because I'm being raised by a grandparent. And what really struck me is that it wouldn't matter where I was in the country, suburban, urban, or rural. And it wouldn't matter if I was at a private school where the annual tuition was in the tens of thousands of dollars per year, or if I was at a school that was 99% free and reduced lunch. Like, it did not matter. The social economic status of the population did not matter, that everyone was being touched by addiction.
So that experience, I've seen the TED Talk. I'm a huge fan of it. The fact that you were able to pull that off that quickly, I love hearing the backstory of that, because I think it speaks to your ability to translate what you're feeling as you're drawing, like that helps that process for you. But I'm wondering what it was like to then share that story, have that just be known by not just your local community, right, but by a million plus people, and what that did for how you kind of understand your story when you went to schools to talk to kids and they'd say, I'm just like you. And you start to hear that repetitive kind of, I understand this experience too. Did that change your narrative a bit for how you felt very possibly isolated and alone when you were a kid?
Absolutely. And Lisa, I'm gonna back up too, because you said, beyond my local community didn't even know. I mean, that's something that I talked about very often. And obviously I was always very open that I was raised by my grandparents because I wanted to honor them. And I remember when my very first book was published, I was doing an interview with the Worcester Telegram and Gazette, and the reporter really wanted to know a little bit more about the dedication for that first book. The dedication for my first book read, "For Grandma and Grandpa, the best parents a kid could ask for." And I very much at the beginning wanted to guard that because I didn't want that to be the narrative. Like, I just wanted to be Jarrett. I just wanted to be the Jarrett who made these books. And then I became the lunch lady guy. And then I became known as the Jedi Academy guy, right? And doing these fun, quirky books. So not only was that was the first time I spoke on any stage, in any room, so openly about what I dealt with. And I did so knowing it could help people and that it was an engaging story that would hopefully connect with the audience. But exactly what you said is that when I delivered that talk and I would visit these schools, those kids who shared their stories made me feel so much less alone. Because even as an adult, I thought I was the only kid who dealt with that. And at the time I certainly thought, I'm the only kid at Gates Lane School who deals with this. I'm the only kid in Worcester who deals with this. I'm the only kid in Massachusetts who deals with this, which was so far from the truth. But what delivering that TED Talk trained me for was how to share my story publicly, and then how to navigate the world with people, strangers, knowing so much personal information about me. It was about a month after I delivered the talk. And I don't know that it had made to TED.com yet, but it was certainly going viral on YouTube and Facebook through TEDx. And I was visiting a school, and it was somewhere in eastern Massachusetts. I can't remember what town it was. And as is the case, I try to get there as early as I can, and especially with Mass Pike traffic. And I happened to get there so early that I was almost too early. So I said, I'm going to go to a Dunkin' Donuts and just grab a coffee, grab a French curler, and just sit and just chill for a little bit. And as I'm just enjoying my snack, this woman came up to me and said, did you just give a TED Talk? And I said, wow, I did. And we talked a little bit, and I said, so I'll see you over at the school then in a few minutes. And she cocked an eyebrow and looked at me incredulously, like, I'm not following you. And I said, well, I'm giving a talk at the school. So, you're a teacher, right? Or you're a librarian. And I had assumed that if she knew who I was, she was either a classroom teacher or a school librarian or a bookseller. And she was a nurse. She was none of those things. And then she's like, no, I really love TED Talks. And then, awkwardly walked away. And then it really hit me that while this stranger knows so many intimate details about me because I shared it so publicly.
Jarrett, I can really identify, not on that level. Obviously, I have not given a TED Talk, although I might have submitted one to TEDx a couple years ago. So to be continued. However, I've done a lot of work like this on the podcast, and like we shared before we hit record, I'm somebody with lived experience in recovery, have been on both sides, where been a patient at Spectrum and now a clinician at Spectrum. And part of the reason why I'm sharing this is a few years ago, I was able to have an opportunity to put something out there in a commercial, and it ran, and I would get texts from people that I know, oh, I heard you on the commercial. And I thought that was all well and good until I was waiting in line. I'm a father of 3. At this time, I was a father of 2, waiting in line in parent pickup at the elementary school. And somebody who I barely knew said, oh, I heard your commercial on the radio. And I, like you, wanted to lead with something that could grab their attention right away. So I said something to the effect of, I showed up to Spectrum on parole. And then
in the commercial, you said that?
In the commercial, I said that.
Okay. Yeah.
And I'm processing this at the elementary school that, wait, I just told this guy I barely knew that here I am at the elementary school, but I was in jail. Right. And it turned out it actually opened up a much larger conversation with this guy. And we became pretty close as a result of it. But for the reasons you shared and what I just shared, I'm wondering how you navigate that now, your story very publicly out there, and you yourself as a father and a husband and a family man. What do your children know or think of what you do for work? And have you shared anything about your own upbringing with your own family?
Yeah, well, so to answer the first part about how do I contend with that, I mean, the TED Talk certainly taught me that I can't be everything to everyone. And so I would get a lot of emails or DMs. And so before Hey Kiddo was published, I knew that, like, okay, I should probably close down DMs and not have my personal email on my website to protect me, because then I live with anxiety of, oh my gosh, there's like 20 people in my inbox who shared something intensely personal and I haven't had a chance to write them back yet. Right. So I feel like I'm letting those people down. So always very open with their kids from a very early age. The fact that I was raised by my grandparents and why I was raised by my grandparents, for 2 reasons. One, my grandparents are no longer here, and I want my children to know them and know that they were my mom and dad. And 2, that my children need to know from a very early age that addiction is in our DNA, and that they will be more prone to falling victim to addiction as they grow up, and I want them to have those tools to navigate the world as they enter into it. And each kid, we gave my eldest was entering 4th grade when the book was released. So I had her read the book before it was published, because I knew that there was a good chance that she might have some peers who have got a hold of the book before she would say some details about the book that she didn't know about her family history. Right. And then our middle, when she got to be 3rd or 4th grade, we had her read it, and we'll do the same with our son when he gets a little bit older. And that's not to say that we don't talk about a lot of those things. It's just a whole other level of gravity to see it and to be surrounded in a story. And in fact, my eldest, when she was in 4th grade, she voiced the kid version of Jarrett in the audiobook of Hey Kiddo. If you haven't listened to it, we made a full cast audiobook of Hey Kiddo with about 60 different actors. I guess I should say using the word actors fairly loosely, because I had a lot of the real people in the book and who were acting for the first time. So, my aunts were like sisters to me, some high school teachers, my buddy Pat from growing up, they all came in and recorded as themselves. And what's going to be interesting as my kids continue to grow is just navigating the fact that sometimes now they're going to be meeting people for the first time, befriending people for the first time who know the books. And one of the greatest compliments my kids could ever give me is that they said, I forget that your books are out there, and that your books are famous because to me you're just dad, right? So that tells me like I'm doing everything I need to do in the house to be just a regular dad, right? But they'll go and in the world around, like now that you go into high school and you go to middle school and there's more people, where halfway through the school year kids will make the connection between their last name and to say, I grew up reading your dad's books. And for my eldest, she has had friends who have opened up to her about addictions in their family because they know that she sort of knows that experience. My daughter doesn't know it firsthand. She knows it secondhand through me. And it's going to be really interesting too, because in some cases now, Hey Kiddo is required reading for certain schools, right? Or certain grades. Like I was very grateful that my daughter was in the health section that she was in ninth grade, because the other health section, Hey Kiddo, was required reading. It's like, I don't want to put her on the spot like that. But she does joke about how if she did have to write essays about the book, if she would cite the primary source as being my dad.
That's so fantastic. And I think one of the things that really strikes me, and I've been doing this work in the addiction space and supporting families for a really long time. And so, I've been working with UMass's Lifeline for Kids and doing a lot of work with childhood trauma and related to parental substance use. And, years ago when we first started having these conversations before Hey Kiddo came out, there was just nothing right out there for media, for books. There were a couple of books, but they were geared to really little kids. Or Sesame Street does a wonderful job now, and they do a great job at there's videos, there's all kinds of cool stuff, but nothing for that older, fourth grade to middle school kind of age. There's just not been anything. And the fact that your book, as challenging as it might be for your kids to navigate in school, could be required reading for schools.
Well, yeah.
It's fantastic. I can't even tell you what that does to really break the stigma for whole families. And I think that could do something to shift the generational kind of impact over time. Because what I see, right, having done this for a while, I've seen, generational individuals kind of come through my programs where I know their parents, I know them, I know now then know their kids. Like I've been doing this long enough for that to start to happen. And you really can see that generational impact. And the things that break that is this transparency, is this conversation, is not kind of keeping it in the shadows and just describing addiction as real as you describe it, right? Because I think you were at just the right time to do it, because your description of it matches kind of everything I've been around for many, many years. But the other thing that I want to make sure I say, because this is probably the biggest thing that struck me in reading the book, is your ability to, particularly at the end in your kind of acknowledgments too, to really acknowledge the whole person, right? To talk really real about just how hard it was, how difficult it was, not pull any punches as you described, right? But then also be able to share the wonderful things about your mother, the wonderful things about your grandparents, and that those two things can exist in the same space, right? None of us are all of our addiction, and none of us are everything but the addiction.
Yes. No. And I'm so grateful that I did not write the book at 23. At 23, everything was very much still black and white for me, heroes versus villains. And at 23, I was still in my mind, in my life, my mother was the villain. And, over time and, rekindling our relationship and working on that throughout my 20s. And you get to the point where you realize that the villain isn't the person, but the substance, but the addiction, but the disease. And my mother did die of a heroin overdose, and certainly when I went through her house and I was going through some of her personal effects, like it really hit me that she had no choice in this matter. I mean, I'm lucky enough that I had her for as many years as I did. Not everyone who struggles with that level of addiction makes it to the age she was. And when I became a parent myself, that really, you think about the thing about becoming a parent is that suddenly your parents are human beings, right? They're not just, they're just complicated, flawed individuals. And how hard that must have been for her to give up custody of me. And as you go through life, you realize that life isn't black and white. People are just varying shades of complicated.
Well said. Well said. And I can certainly identify, like I said, as being a parent. I liked how all three of us laughed on here that,
Yes, yeah.
parents become human, right?
Yes, they do.
I certainly have had a transition of how I viewed my own childhood, with my own use, and then other factors that played into there. And today I say my parents did the best they could with what they had. And
yes, 100%.
We have a great relationship today, and my condolences about your mother. The tagline of the book, even, keeping with this genuine, real honesty theme here, the tagline of the book that drew me in right away was how I lost my mother, found my father, and dealt with family addiction. And you're very open and honest in this book about how your father was not in your life for the majority of your formative years. I'm just wondering if you could speak on that at all, and how that affected you, and maybe how the relationship, if any, is today as an adult looking back.
Yeah, of course, I had a lot of anger towards my father when I was young. I don't hold that same anger now. When I was 16, I heard from him for the first time. He wrote me a letter. I wasn't yet ready to respond to that letter. And during my senior year, I did write back, and he wrote back with a photo of himself with his other two children that he went on to have, my half brother and half sister, who that really hit me because I didn't know I had siblings, and there was no denying, looking at their faces, that we were siblings. And he would not have been capable to have been the father I would have needed when I was a kid. I had the best dad I could possibly have in my grandfather. He was kind and funny and steadfast. And yes, he did struggle with drinking. There was a time, and there's so many things, you can't write everything in the book, but there was a time where he did lose his license for driving drunk. And, and I did actually, this other part I didn't mention in the book, where there were plenty of times where he just didn't come home right from work to have dinner with the family, and he went out to the bar instead and came home just completely drunk. And so my birth father, I'm very lucky that over the years we were able to develop a friendship.
And your relationship with your grandparents really struck me in reading it, because you could almost see how the process of writing and drawing it kind of really helped you kind of see things in the way that you needed to. You could actually see that, at least how I view it. You tell me if I'm right or wrong, because obviously you're the author and writer of your own story. But it seemed like there was a progression throughout the book of your recognition of the impact of substances with your grandparents, right? That an evolution of kind of seeing it and recognizing it for what it was. And that, to me, that kind of goes from like the black and white, like mom bad, grandparents great, right?
Mm-hmm.
To
right, yes.
Seeing people in the ways that they are, right? And so seeing them for the good things that they are and the challenging things that come with being a human.
Because you wonder, as an author, you're trying to figure out what the motivations of your characters are. Right? So now these are real people, and not all of which were still alive for me to talk to. And so my mother's addiction wasn't created in a vacuum. She had a very fraught relationship with her mother. They fought quite a bit. There was a certain amount of jealousy that I think that my grandmother had over my grandfather's relationship with my mother. That father-daughter relationship was very tight. And then you realize, okay, well, my grandmother was drinking a lot. Well, what caused her to drink a lot? What caused her to be drunk before the kids came home from school? And then you get to the point where you're like, well, am I going to go back to, go back down the lineage and find the first bad parent that side had in Sweden. I'm not, and it's unfortunate the way, some of those relationships panned out. And we can't change the past. All we can do is learn from it.
Yeah. One of the things that when doing a lot of this work around parental substance use and working on kind of childhood trauma that we've been focusing a lot on is the concept of it's not what happened, it's what happens after. It's the repair, right? And so can you speak to when you've had opportunities for repair with your mom, either throughout your relationship or certainly probably most profoundly, later in your relationship, and how, the attempts at repair and how that repair would happen to keep that connection going with your grandparents, even when maybe your grandfather would come home, drunk and that wasn't a good experience?
There really was no true repair with my mother, in that she was never able to truly express any kind of sorrow or apology for the way her life impacted mine. She would always point to the fact that addiction is a disease, which it is. But it was very much like, well, you had nothing to complain about because you had everything you needed, right? Which is true. Like in that respect, I had a privileged childhood. I didn't see my grandparents stress about money. There was food on the table and there were Christmas presents under the tree. So while I'll never have that with her, I'm going to have it with my kids. So when I behave in such a way that negatively affects the kids, when we sit down and talk about it, and I do something that I never got from any of my parents, be it my birth mother or my grandparents, which is an apology and an explanation. And, and what you said was repair. And part of that, probably a generational thing. I mean, certainly with my grandparents, it would be a generational thing. My grandfather often said to me that I was his second chance at fatherhood, because when all of the other kids were very young, he was so busy trying to build his business and support the family financially. And then, of course, when you think of that and how that lines up with my grandmother's drinking and how it lines up with my mother's adolescence, it kind of all makes sense. So, yeah.
Everything is connected, right, Jarrett? And there's no,
it is,
addiction in a vacuum. And certainly I love the fact as someone in recovery and as a clinician and as someone who I should lend to this conversation that I've done work as a family engagement specialist for years and an inpatient level. So, I would speak to the person coming into inpatient treatment on a level of, hey, I remember when I came here for treatment. And then I would speak to the parents of that person or the relative or the friend or whomever was dropping that person off and offer, our Fast Magnolia family support group that we run every week, or, hey, why don't you come to the visitation and we'll do a psychoeducational class before about addiction and learn about how it's a disease, right? So I can certainly, lend that to this conversation. And now yet here's another tool that I can point to for the families that haven't yet got to the level of understanding and really acceptance. I'm hearing acceptance from you of can't go back and change the past. Like Lisa said, it is what it is. It happened. Now what? And right, really your story is striking me as, breaking that generational curse or changing that around in your family after multiple generations of addiction. Here you are learning from that experience and doing something different.
Yes, for sure.
One of the things that, in reading the book and in hearing your perspective that I think we've started to evolve in the addiction treatment space is this idea that parents, when they are struggling with substance use, actively using, or even working on recovery, should be like put over here, right? And and they shouldn't have access to their kids, and sometimes, of course, incarceration makes that kind of impossible, and we need to just stop incarcerating those with substance use disorders, because that creates forced separation. But even in the treatment field, like for years really were like, you know what, let's let mom, dad, caregiver like figure their stuff out, and let's keep the kid over here not connected to them, right? And you were fortunate enough that you had a soft space to land, right, in that you had your grandparents and weren't put into, you know, any foster systems or those environments. But, you know, I think we're starting to recognize that it's beneficial not just for the parent, but for the child to, in whatever ways are safe and appropriate, keep that connection, right? I think your mom tried to do what she could with letters that you were able to, you know, to have and to keep, but she didn't really have a lot of access, right? Like even at Spectrum back in the day, right? Like we just had like a family event for holidays, or we had, you know, maybe once a week, but with kids less often. And I think we're starting to realize that that's actually less helpful, right? That gives people with experience kind of less opportunity to keep that connection and build that purpose into their recovery.
I agree. You know, I mean, there was so much that went unsaid in those earlier days. And, you know, just because a kid isn't asking the question doesn't mean that they're not anxiously wondering the entire time what happened to their parent.
And if kids don't know what's happening, they create the narrative themselves, right? So they fill in the blanks with a story that might not be accurate or helpful.
Yes. Yeah.
So that's why it's so important to be transparent on a age appropriate level. You know, I've looked over your website and just I'm so excited. There's so many different resources and just so much good stuff to dive into. And you know, Hey Kiddo, the graphic memoir, recommended for readers age 12 and up, right? And you know, what do we do, like you said, with your own children around grades 3 or 4? And even in my own experience, like there was a situation just the other day where one of our kids was complaining about the, you know, brothers, whatever, you know, sibling rivalry stuff. And I mentioned something about, you know, hey, be grateful that you have roommates that are so nice to you. Daddy didn't have great roommates. And I referenced the story my wife knew from my past, and you know, to put that spin on it. So yes, you're laying the foundation at any age, because like you so perfectly said, just because the question's not asked doesn't mean that they're not anxiously awaiting. And you speak to that so well in your book as well, where your friends, your peers, either neighbors or people in your school, you know, you're sort of comparing notes about family experiences and wondering why yours is different than others.
For sure. Yeah, for sure.
And, you know, I know we're kind of getting to the, you know, close to the end of our time here, but the other thing that strikes me in both your TED Talk and your book and in the way that you describe your experience really resonates with me, that, you know, your art, of course, and your drawing really allowed you to kind of have an escape and to do something, you know, with kind of all of the emotions that you were feeling. But you also had a lot of teachers and safe adults in your life, right? And that's a huge protective factor that can really help kids, right? And I don't think that teachers recognize often enough what the huge impact they have, and coaches and all of the folks in your life. Can you speak just for a minute on what that was like for you growing up, having, you know, teachers and others?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I always had great teachers at Gates Lane School, where I went kindergarten through 8th grade. But when I got to high school, Holy Name High School, I mean, I had several teachers. I really should shine the spotlight on Mrs. Robin Casey, who is in Hey Kiddo. And she had hired me to be the cartoonist for the school newspaper. But she was also my class moderator, and I was one of the class officers. And I think that was a whole other part of my life that didn't make it into the book, because again, you can't put everything in there. And she would just really listen to me quite a bit when I was processing some pieces. You know, she was aware of my background, and I think that's a big part of the connections that were made to get me to work for the newspaper, to draw the cartoons for the newspaper, to empower me in that way. But when my father first wrote, I knew that her classroom was a safe space. And after school, I went in and asked if I could talk, and she closed the door, and she just listened to me. And I remember the next day she put like this like little teddy bear at my locker to offer me some solace. So I knew I knew that I had somebody in her that was completely outside of my family too, that I could talk about these big things that I was going through.
And how great that you had that resource. And certainly I echo Lisa's sentiments of how there's really so many unsung heroes that don't often get the credit they deserve, like the teachers and the class moderators of the experience. And today, again, coming full circle, now you're going into schools and you're doing meetings and drawing for, I think I saw somewhere in research for this, like upwards of like hundreds of kids at a time, and keeping them all quiet and engaged. That's a skill that we all should learn from. I'm wondering if you could just speak for a minute to any kids maybe going through a similar situation you did, or even kids that are interested in art and how to make that dream a reality like you so wonderfully have.
Something that I say at the end of my school presentations is that, we all have our special intelligences. So for me, my special intelligence was art, and I was able to use that art. And growing up is so difficult. Being a kid is difficult no matter what you're dealing with. But then if you're dealing with, addictions in your family, like there's a whole other level of difficult. So, whatever your special intelligence is, you can use that to buoy you through childhood, and you can use that to be your vocation someday. And your special intelligence might be art. It could be athleticism. It could be music. It could be interpersonal skills. You could grow up to be a counselor and use those intelligences you have to help people. And we all have something. We just have to find what that something is.
And I think we really need to support that in schools. My daughter's an artist. She went to one of your Worcester Art Museum talks. I think she still has the Princess Leia you drew off a smiley face. Like
that's great.
Have it in her room. And I think sometimes it kind of gets pushed aside, right? Like that we need to focus on like the math and science and English, but ignore kind of the art and ignore the music. And even sometimes, not always, depends on your space, right? Ignore the sports. And I think that's really, that recognition that that everybody has their own special intelligence. I love that. Right. And that's a protective factor. That's what like keep you going and could then turn into, what you do with your life. And I think you just have such a wonderful example of how you did that and show that to kids. That's so great.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Yes, no, I mean, art and music and sports as well. It's not easy to assign a number on a state test for. So,
well said. Well said. And I certainly, I was telling Lisa before we hit record here, exploring all the books that you wrote. I think there's over 40 of them now, right?
46.
46. Wow. Okay. And I got one coming to my house in a couple days, and I can't wait to read with my children and piece through all that. And who knows, maybe when the time comes to explain addiction on a deeper level, age appropriate, I know I have one resource that I can at least give the kids. Hey, kiddo.
That's great.
Well, I'm just going to give my own daughter a bit of a shout out. She has her art being on display. She's a student at Wachusett High School, and she has her art on display in March at the Worcester Art Museum. I just had to sign a permission slip last night for that. So pretty excited about that. But honestly, Jarrett, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you so much for all that you do to be a light in the world. And you really are truly a gift to so many, and probably way more than you'll ever recognize. But I am just personally very appreciative of your time and you joining us on Airing Addiction today. Thank you so very much.
Lisa, thank you so much for your kind words. And Sean, thank you for sharing your stories with me as well.
Thanks so much.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
All right. Thanks. Appreciate it.
Bye, everyone. Thank you so much for this. I appreciate you. Thanks for all of your work.
Thanks.